series, a set of 3 webinars organized jointly by ITEN at the Organization of American States and our partner organization, Teachers Without Borders. This is also the first time that both organizations will provide a certification to those participants who attend all 3 events and also complete all assignments. Now I would like to introduce you to Konrad Glogoski, who's the Executive Director of Teachers Without Borders. He is going to explain to you a little bit more about this series of webinars and what participants need to accomplish to get the joint certification from the OAS and Teachers Without Borders. So good morning, Konrad. Good to have you here. And I expect that you will also introduce Krista, our guest speaker today.
Adriana, thank you for that wonderful introduction. I just want to say hello to everyone, and of course thank you for joining us today for the launch of what we believe to be a very innovative webinar-based approach to teacher professional development. My name is Konrad Glagowski, and I am the Executive Director at Teachers Without Borders. We are a global nonprofit organization dedicated to making it easier for teachers to access valuable and relevant professional development resources, both online and face-to-face, and to connect with colleagues from around the world. If you're interested in learning more about Teachers Without Borders, please visit us at twb.org, and you can also visit our social network, which you can find at twbglobal.org. I also want to thank our partners, the Inter-American Teacher Education Network at the Organization of American States, for making this pilot webinar series possible. They are providing the tools necessary for this series to be a success. And especially, I'd like to say a big thank you to Monica de la Garza for her untiring support and hard work on this pilot series. The reason we are here today, connected as educators interested in improving our professional practice, is because of Monica and her colleagues at the Inter-American Teacher Education Network. So a big thank you to all of them. And as Adriana mentioned at the beginning, I'd like to say a few words about the facilitator of this webinar series. All 3 webinars will be facilitated by Krista Tinari. She is a highly experienced educator who has been teaching the skills of peacemaking to adults and children for over 15 years. She has worked directly with very diverse groups of students of all ages, and she has also worked with teachers, with adults. She has trained and mentored hundreds of educators in conflict resolution, peace education, pedagogy, and strategies. Krista is the founder of Peace Praxis, an organization that focuses on helping schools and educators better understand issues such as bullying prevention, behavior management, conflict resolution, peace education, and social and emotional learning, just to name a few. Peace Praxis is a valued Teachers Without Borders partner, and we are delighted that Krista has agreed to work with us and with the Inter-American Teacher Education Network to facilitate these 3 webinars. So I'm sure Krista will address all of the details involved in those next steps and the required work that's necessary for those of you who are interested in obtaining the certificate. Thank you very much once again for joining us. We hope you enjoy all 3 webinars, and we hope that you choose to work towards the certificate. And of course, we would be more than honored to provide that for you at the end of the 3rd webinar, once you, of course, complete successfully all of the required tasks. So thank you very much. Thank you to our partners at ITEN, and we look forward to your interactions and your engagement. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the introduction, Conrad, and for the wonderful work that TWB does. And thank you, Monica, for all of your help, and for ITEN for hosting this. It's really a pleasure. So we're going to get started. We have about 40 minutes to do the rest of the webinar. And as you know, the webinar is on basic conflict resolution skills. And today we're going to focus on using the STAR strategy. I have a presentation for everyone, so I hope everyone is able to see it and follow along as we go. And as I understand it, it will also be made available after the workshop as well, so you will be able to access this information again. Let me quickly let you know up front that we will get to most of the slides in this presentation, but perhaps not all, as the third webinar in this series will be focusing on implementation of these strategies, the STAR strategy, and also bullying prevention strategies for students that I'll be covering during the second webinar. So let's get started here. Let's see if I can. Okay, so the STAR strategy is one of many different types of conflict resolution strategies. But for those of you who are familiar with conflict resolution strategies, it has familiar components. So STAR strategy stands for stop, think, act, and reflect. So there's 4 steps to it. And I'm going to be going over each step with you and discuss how you can teach those steps to your students as well. So why did I choose to share with you the STAR strategy? I chose to share it for several reasons. The first is that it's a student-centered approach to conflict resolution, and we'll be discussing what that means. Secondly, it can be adapted to suit students' age levels. So I have used STAR and components of STAR with very young children, say 5 years old, and I have also used it with much older students, high school students. As we go through the session today, I'd like you to think about your age level students and how you might use this information in a way that would be developmentally appropriate to your own group of students. Of course, in English, STAR is an acronym meaning a star, and so it's easy for our students to remember as well. With STAR, we teach students various critical social emotional skills. Again, I'll be reviewing those. We can also use STAR both for internal conflicts we might be experiencing as well as interpersonal conflict. So today we'll focus on interpersonal conflict uses for STAR. And once students learn this strategy, they can use it in the classroom or anywhere else outside of the classroom as well. When I've taught this to students, I've had students report that they begin to use it at home and with friends and in different areas. So that's a really good thing that they can use anywhere they are. Okay, actually, I would like to, we're going to do a poll before I go on to the next slide. So hopefully a poll will show up here with a few questions there about how you typically handle conflict in the classroom. Great, here it is. So there's several responses there. What conflict resolution approaches are you most likely to use in the classroom? And if you could choose one response, just click on the response there and we'll see what our typical approaches are. I'll give everyone a moment to do this. Fantastic, we can see the responses right here. It's what a great tool. So we saw that a lot of people use a strategy where you're actually teaching your students conflict resolution. So perhaps you teach them a strategy similar to this or perhaps another. And I hope that you'll participate in our online group after the webinar to share some of those approaches with us. So 40% of you said you're teaching them a conflict resolution strategy. And then we have some other strategies. Ignoring, no one here is a fan of that approach. I guess we're proactive about our conflict here. separating students using disciplinary consequences. Some of you do that, and it might be appropriate at times. Tell students what to do, or refer students to peer mediation, which I know was a previous webinar that was held. So, of course, we want to have different strategies that we can use for different situations. At the same time, some of us tend to have a go-to strategy that we might use more often than not, so I was curious about it. I'd like to discuss teacher-centered approaches versus student-centered approaches. As I mentioned, S.T.A.R is a student-centered approach. And these are two contrasting approaches to conflict resolution in the classroom. And with a teacher-centered approach, we're going to look at conflict from a teacher's perspective and think of conflict as something that's disrupting the day, something that we want to try to get rid of in the classroom, and it really seems like it's a distraction and perhaps it's a deficit that students have. We can also think of an approach to conflict being student-centered. Okay, and student-centered means that we're thinking about conflict and the role that it plays in our students' lives, its developmental importance, how it can be a natural learning opportunity, and we can also provide students with tools that they can use in the classroom to solve their own conflicts. And that's really what S.T.A.R is. So in this student-centered approach, we would help students develop the skills that they need, and we would train them in the strategy that we can then prompt them to use when they do need it. And I'd like to point out the last bullet point there. It says, teacher invites students to set goals and track progress. This is a really important part of the student-centered approach, and it means that instead of the teacher doing all of the evaluation and telling students how much progress they're making, whether they're doing it right or doing it wrong, we're going to put the responsibility in the hands of students and ask them, what is a goal that you have this week for conflict resolution? How close have you gotten to meeting that goal? What's something that you could do to improve? Now, we use different language if we're speaking with younger students or older students, but the key is that we would actually have students set their own goals and track their progress along the way so that they can begin to feel both responsible for resolving their own conflicts and also empowered. So that's why that last piece is so important. Okay, so the S.T.A.R strategy in summary is a problem-solving process. Students will be learning and practicing social, emotional, and foundation abilities for conflict resolution. They'll be actually resolving problems, which I know is important, and we're holding them accountable for their own behavior. So instead of sending them to the office or just punishing them but not having them right their wrong or doing it for them, we're going to have them be accountable. Okay, that last slide mentioned foundation abilities. Some of you might be familiar with Bodine and Crawford's work. They did a lot of great work in conflict resolution and looking at what they call foundation abilities, or abilities that students need to begin to learn and begin to have some sense of accomplishment with so that they can be successful with a conflict resolution process. And one mistake I see new conflict resolution teachers making is that they expect students to be able to go ahead and solve their problems, but without really doing work on these foundation abilities. So the first foundation ability has to do with values, and that is, what do our students care about, and how do they feel about compassion, justice, nonviolence versus violence? Do they value these things over violence, over aggression, over power, over people, etc.? So that's an important one for us to take a look at and do some work on. The most important thing about values is that we start where students are. And we don't tell them their values are wrong, but we explore the meaning of the values for them. How are they currently serving them in their lives, and how are they currently not serving them? And then we can engage them in activities to begin to question and think about values. The second thing is perspective taking and empathy. So perspective taking skills have to do with imagining what it's like to be someone else, to stand in someone else's shoes. And empathy is taking it one step further and understanding the person's feelings so that maybe you would feel those feelings too. Perspective taking and empathy can be practiced in many different ways. We can practice it in literature or language arts exercises. We can practice it in social studies by having students take different points of view. The important thing is that we begin to practice the skill with them in various ways, not just when they're having a conflict with someone. The third thing is emotional awareness and self-control. So emotional awareness and self-control means teaching students about feelings, how they're impacting their actions and their words, and understanding themselves so that they can handle their emotions better, be able to use a cool down strategy, which we are going to go over in this webinar. The fourth is communication skills. Communication skills has to do with speaking and listening in a way that's understood. And again, I'll review some of those communication skills for the STAR strategy. And 5 and 6 are together there in that last box, creative thinking and critical thinking skills. So creative thinking is thinking of various solutions to problem. Critical thinking skills involves application of these skills to your life, compare and contrast, those different types of skills. You might notice that all of these skills are skills that we would normally want to go over with many of our academic content areas as well. So we don't have to think about conflict resolution as something totally separate or something that's only about social emotional learning, but we can weave it into our content material that we normally do with students as well. Okay, so let's go over the first step in the STAR strategy. So obviously the first step stands for stop. And stop means stop what you're doing, take a time out, and use a cool down strategy to handle emotions to stop the fight, flight, freeze response. Some of you might see that above the PowerPoint presentation there is a little icon of a man there, and you could raise your hand if you want to by clicking on that. I'm curious if you want to raise your hand to answer the question if you're familiar with the fight, flight, freeze response. Raise your hand if you're familiar with it. Okay, great. Great, I'm seeing some hands raised there. Okay, well, I will go over that briefly then, just for those of you who aren't familiar. By the way, this is the hardest step. I think we've probably all experienced going further with a conflict than we might have wanted to because we weren't able to stop ourselves in the moment when it got emotional or difficult. Okay, the brain's response to physical and psychological threats. So most of you are familiar that the body has a particular response when it goes into the fight, flight, freeze reaction. What happens is there is a activation of a hormonal system and stress system in our body and in our brain. And we have a decreased activity in the front part of our brain that helps us problem solve. And we have increased activity in the back part of our brain that's closest to our brain stem that helps us to react quickly. This is very helpful when we have an emergency situation, but it can also mean that we might react too quickly when we would rather stop and take a break. So the important part here is that this is a response that we have when there is danger in our environment, in our world out there. Perhaps we see, a poisonous snake, and we would have this reaction. Well, interestingly enough, this is the same reaction that we have to a psychological or an emotional threat. So students could have the fight, flight, freeze reaction when someone else disrespects them, or they're called a name, or they feel embarrassed or uncertain, this could trigger their brain to have the same reaction. So as you know, or if you're not in the classroom yet, as you might imagine, there are many instances where students might experience these emotions in the classroom and might be going into the fight, flight, freeze response. Okay? So what we know is that this response can be fully activated within about 6 seconds. That means we have a brief window of time to stop that reaction from really taking over our body. If the reaction goes full out, full on, it can take about 40 minutes for our body to actually return to our normal state. That means for our heart rate to go back to normal, our breathing rate, our perspiration, the activity in our brain, all of that. So, wow, that would take a long time. If all of our students are experiencing fight, flight, freeze, we really can't do much with them in the classroom for academic learning for another 40 minutes. So we want to be able to help them so that they don't experience this fight, flight, freeze response. So the STAR strategy recommends that we use some cool down techniques. You could also consider these to be calm down techniques, how we can help ourselves calm down when we get agitated this way. So I'm going to review several, and then you might have some additional ones that you've used. The first is positive self-talk or affirmations. And those are statements that might give us a sense of confidence about a situation. So telling yourself, I can handle this, it will pass, it's really not bad, I've had this situation before and I've handled it. All of those statements are examples of positive self-talk. Many students find these types of statements to be very helpful for them. So if we can review with students statements that might work for them, this would be a good strategy they could use. I notice some of you are having difficulty with the sound. I encourage you to hang in there. Some people are getting it and some people aren't. My microphone seems to be on, and so I'm going to continue. But please know that you'll have access to this as a recording after the session. Okay, the second strategy is the zoom out strategy. And I have a picture of the Earth from space there. This strategy is one that helps students put things into perspective. So they would imagine themselves first standing in the classroom with their other students around them. Then they would imagine perhaps the school building. Then they would imagine maybe the state or geographic area where they live. Then maybe they would imagine the continent and then the globe, and then looking at the globe from space. Why is this helpful? This is a helpful strategy because it helps students put their problem into perspective and realize that life is big. Life is big, and they're just having a small experience right now that they'll probably be able to handle. The third strategy is take a break, get a water, or get something to eat. This is a very effective strategy because it involves the body. And when we go into fight, flight, freeze, the body does not want to take in food or water. So this is opposite, sending an opposite signal to the body and letting the body know it's okay to calm down, that we're going to get a drink of water or a snack. Another strategy would be journaling, writing out your frustrations. A lot of students like to scribble or color. Some students then rip those up. I have a little mini, it's like a mini garbage pail. It's really only maybe 8 inches high that students can journal and scribble and then put their paper in there to sort of get their frustrations out. Another strategy is maybe distract yourself by listening to music, using humor, doing a puzzle. And here's 4 more. Imagining a favorite place or thing. I've often done an exercise with students where I will have them cut out pictures or bring in from a magazine or bring pictures from home or draw a picture that is a drawing of one of their favorite places or things. And then they can keep that picture with them in their backpack or in their desk, and they can take it out and look at it when they need it to use a cool down strategy. Of course, we can always walk away or take a break. Some students really respond to exercise, so walking briskly or doing jumping jacks or something physical. And then also finally relax and breathe. So it's very important when we teach students the breathing strategy that we teach them correct breathing, that we want to teach them deep breathing. If you ask your students to take some deep breaths and they go, that's not very calming. So we need to teach them about deep breathing and belly breathing rather than shallow breathing. So you could have them place their hands on their belly. With younger children, you could have them imagine blowing up a balloon and filling up their belly with air. Some of you might be familiar with yoga or some type of stretching that you could implement with your students as well. So those are a whole bunch of strategies. At some Catholic schools I work at, they use prayer. Some people might want to talk to a friend. So we have another poll now asking you which strategy you use for yourself. And then we can get a sense of the different strategies that you like to use. Okay, it doesn't look like the poll is coming up, but here, thank you. Sorry, Monica, I need to give you a little time. Thank you. Okay, here is the poll. So if you have another strategy, people are using chat to write it down. So I see some people saying they use a variety of strategies, which is great. Take the breathing strategy and take a break, and positive self-talk seem to be very popular. Fantastic. One thing that I recommend that you do is that you don't keep your strategies secret. You know, there's no reason why we can't share with our students what strategies we like to use and actually tell students when we're using them in the classroom. I know a teacher who has a rocking chair in her classroom, and she likes to use that strategy, and she will tell her students, I'm taking a time out, and will rock in her chair, maybe, for a minute, 1 minute. But her students really respect that and respect that she needs that time and that she's taking care of herself that way. So when we begin to model these strategies, we can show students that this isn't about being a kid. This isn't like kids need cool down strategies. This is a life skill, and adults use these skills as well. Great. Okay. Some classrooms create a peace corner where students can go to use these strategies. I will be discussing that more during the third webinar when we talk about implementation. This is a picture of a second grade classroom, and they have a little bench there that is their cool down area. You can't see it in the picture, but there's a poster over here that has a reminder of the cool down strategies. Okay. Before we go on to the next part of S.T.A.R, the reminder that if S.T.A.R isn't working, it's usually because we're trying to use it too soon, and we have not given students time to cool down. When students are very upset, they tend to call names, and they also actually decrease their self-control. It's more difficult for them to problem solve. So let's give them the time that they need to use a cool down strategy and then ask them to use S.T.A.R. Okay, that was step number 1. Step number 2 is think. During the think strategy, we coach students to ask themselves various questions. How do I feel, or how was I feeling? What about the other person? How were they feeling? What was I doing? And this is a key question. Was it Helping or causing a problem. Was what I doing helping or causing a problem? Oftentimes in conflict, students focus on the other person's action. So we're going to redirect them to focus on their own actions. Then we have them think of possible solutions to the conflict. What can I do? What can the other person do? So this is our sort of brainstorming part of conflict here. And many of you are familiar with this already. The third step is the action step. What is the best possible action and solution? And I teach my students some criteria. The action needs to be one that is respectful to both yourself and others. It has to be able to try to make the situation better, not worse. So this is very simple criteria that even young children can understand. Is it respectful? Will it make the situation better or worse? Okay. Then during the action step, we're going to teach students how they can communicate assertively with I messages. I'm curious as to how many of you are already familiar with I messages. I know that it's a common strategy. And then we would brainstorm and offer solutions. So I think there might be a poll there just for us to see if you are familiar with the iMessage strategy. Here we go. Okay, have you taught your students iMessages? Yes or no? It's a race between yes and no. Okay, it looks like about 65 or 66% of you are already teaching your students iMessages, while about 34% of you, sorry, let me restate that. 65% have not taught your students iMessages. About 35% of you have. So since many of you have not taught them, I will review them briefly because they can be quite helpful. So before I explain that, let me just review this slide here about communication strategies. There's many different communication strategies we can teach students. A very simple one is just waiting their turn to speak. iMessages is another, nonverbal cues, and summarizing point of view. So during the third webinar, I'll have time to go over some more of them. Right now, I will just review the iMessage formula. So the iMessage formula is helpful because it helps students express themselves assertively without making the other person defensive. Instead of using, you did this, you did that, I don't like you, we're going to use I instead. So the formula is this: I feel or felt blank, fill in the emotion. When, state what happened. Because, and then I would like. And the last sentence, I would like, is very important because it's an assertive statement about what the student would like to see happen next. So an example would be, I felt angry when you ripped up my paper because I spent a lot of time on it. I would like you to leave my things alone. And so students, once they learn this formula, can do it with one another during the action step of S.T.A.R. Okay. The final step in the S.T.A.R. process is reflect. I also used to call this step review, but when I started using it more in different schools, we decided reflect was a better word, because one part of this step is to review whether or not the solution worked and whether or not the process worked. But we can also use R to reflect not only on the process, but what our learning has been from using the process. And we could reflect on what went well, what could help me be more successful next time. So The reflect step is one that some people leave out, but I feel it's really important because, again, it builds in accountability for students to really learn this conflict resolution process and be able to assess their own improvement and their own learning with it. So some teachers do this with students. They sit down and discuss it with them. Others have a reflection sheet that's written out that students can fill out after they have used the STAR process. An important thing that I want my students to learn when I teach them STAR is that they are able to solve their problems peacefully, that they are able to use self-control because they have strategies, that they're able to communicate clearly and effectively and really, solve their own problems in the classroom. So this is a picture of a STAR corner in a elementary classroom. Actually, this is showing sort of the top of a tree. There's a large trunk under this tree made out of cardboard, and this is in their Peace Corner, and students go there to use the STAR strategy and solve problems with one another. And there's many reminders about communication techniques and peace and respect in this corner. Okay, so I want to leave some time for questions. So the last thing I'm going to review is the teaching sequence for STAR. So now that you have this information about what STAR is and the steps, you need to know how you can teach this to students in an effective way. So I'll say up front that one mistake that I've seen teachers make is they try to teach STAR in total, all of the steps, to their students all at once. And they only teach it to their students once, and then they want their students to use it. So that would be very difficult to do. It's unlikely that you'll get the outcome that you want if you teach STAR to your students all at once and only once. So you want to teach it to them sequentially. You want to give them time to learn, practice, and understand each step. And most importantly, is you want to teach them the STAR process and these strategies before they actually need to use it in the moment. So we don't want to wait until there's a conflict and then all of a sudden say, we're going to use STAR and this is what you need to do. It's too much in the moment. So we can teach and practice cool down strategies at various parts of our school day. Many teachers practice these strategies perhaps after recess or lunchtime when there have been larger groups of students together and they need to calm their bodies and calm their minds. Practice communication strategies can happen integrated into your academic subjects, such as language arts or literacy. You want to role play scenarios, and sometimes teachers want to know, well, what scenario should we use? You can always get suggestions from your students about scenarios. Have them write down little scenarios, and you look at them first and decide which ones that you want to use for your STAR practice. I mentioned practicing communication during language arts. You can also connect STAR to other academic content. For example, the information about fight, flight, freeze, what happens to the body under stress and conflict. You could integrate that into a science lesson. You could also look at STAR in a social studies class. How did people throughout, in different situations, maybe use STAR or something like STAR to solve problems? You also want to create visual reminders. So after I teach students the stop and think part of STAR, I often will hand out little stars, just small ones. And if a student looks like they might need to use a stop and think strategy, I can just place that star on their desk or give it to them as a silent visual reminder that they need to use that strategy. Here is a poster that I created. You can see it says review for the last step instead of reflect. This was made before I changed that last step. But this was up in a classroom as a bulletin board. And it was a nice visual reminder. Okay, finally, you want to model your own use of the STAR process. As I said before, it's not a secret. We want to be able to maybe share stories with students. Maybe we had a conflict in the morning before we came to school, and we needed to use a cool down strategy, and we needed to think about how the other person was feeling and practice a communication skill. Take 3 or 4 minutes and share that with your students, and share maybe how it was challenging for you and how you were able to then use it successfully. And that's one way that you can be on a learning journey with your students, and they really respect that, I've found. You can also use STAR together as a class to solve shared classroom problems. For example, maybe there are materials in the classroom that are not put away properly, or maybe there aren't enough materials and you need to share, and there's been conflict arising because of that. You can always sit down with your class as a whole and walk them through the STAR process so that you can solve that problem together. When you'd like your students to use STAR, you'll find that you need to prompt them, to remind them to use it, because again, that stop step is the most difficult one. So we can remind our students to use this strategy. And then finally, do not forget to celebrate their progress and success. It's really important that we acknowledge students making progress in this area. Have them reflect, how have I improved over the past month? And then have them share that with you, and you can congratulate them, and you can share with them your own observations. Don't wait until they can do everything perfectly before we give them positive feedback. When you see them making some small improvement in any of these stages of STAR, you can go ahead and acknowledge their improvement there. Okay, so that concludes everything that I wanted to present to you during this webinar, and I know that we wanted time for questions. Before we do that, we have a final poll, and I'm wondering how likely you might be to use the STAR strategy with your students. How likely would you be to use either some of the STAR strategy or all of the STAR strategy? Do you feel like you need more information before you would feel comfortable using it? Or right now, do you think that you could go ahead and try it? So we have an additional poll here. If you have other comments, yes, please feel free to use chat. Great. I see that 45 out of 66 of you would be very likely to plan to start to use all of it or parts of it. That's fantastic. I hope that those of you who may try it do give some piece of it a try. And of course, we can continue to discuss how it's working for you. You will be receiving a link to join the online discussion group through Teachers Without Borders, so that if you are taking this webinar for certification, I'll be posting questions there as your assignment that you can answer and send back to me. Even if you're not taking it, though, as a certification course, I believe you'll still have access to the communication area where you can post questions or post your experience with trying to implement pieces of STAR and seeing how it went for you. Oh, someone's saying they would use it at home with their family, which is fantastic. I know many families now that are using STAR. When I do work at schools and I'm able to introduce this concept to teachers who then can teach it to their students, it's common that I would come back and do a parent presentation as well about how to use STAR at home as a family with your students. And parents have told me that it's something that they really enjoy doing. It gives them lots of positive feelings about their ability to solve problems together.
Thank you, Krista. This is Adriana in Washington, D.C. For a wonderful presentation, and participants, as you have seen, have already given very positive feedback so far. Okay, so we are going to start with the questions. And participants, you can write your questions in the chat as you've been doing now. This is a very enthusiastic group from what I've seen. They have not stopped chatting during the whole presentation and giving their comments.
Okay. Hi, Krista. Thank you.
Hello.
Thank you. How are you? Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. And also thank you to all participants who were present here today. I'm going to try to read those questions out loud for Krista, and I'm going to try to do my best as I have a very small computer here, but I hope we can work this out. Well, from Argentina, Andres is actually right now recommending the beauty and the best for children, the more teenager version. That's what he's saying.
Yes. I'd like to speak to that just for a moment.
Okay, wonderful. You can go ahead.
Yes, the STAR strategy is very effective with students of the middle school age level. They do respond to it quite well. And of course, younger students love that it's this acronym, and we can use the STAR visual that really helps them. With older students, we do want to use more sophisticated scenarios and more sophisticated language when we talk to them about the STAR process. What I find is interesting, though, is that high school students, many of them still have not learned these skills. They have not learned what types of calm down strategies work for them in the classroom. They may not have learned how to perspective take very effectively. And so many of these skills are quite relevant even for older students. So if we can connect these skills, especially at the high school level, to content area, maybe look at a character in a book and look at their problem-solving process, and then talk about self-control and challenges to self-control, and then take that and have a discussion in a classroom, perhaps as a circle discussion or something like that. Students also do respond to it quite well.
Thank you, Krista. Here we have another question and a little bit of a comment from Kelly Dyer. She says, I believe this couplet with the Mind Up and Virtues project could completely solve our bullying and respect problems today. Are you familiar with these two programs? They blend well for an overall character and conflict resolution program.
I am familiar with Mind Up, and that program focuses a lot on emotional skills training, emotional awareness. It's an emotional intelligence curriculum, and I have not personally been involved in training students in Mind Up, but it does overlap somewhat with some of the skills that we discussed today. The Virtues program, it sounds like a character education program, but I am not familiar with it, so I can't comment on it. But if she would like to type in the web address, if she knows where people can find out more information, that would be wonderful, because there are many fantastic programs out there, and so I encourage people sharing the ones that they have had experience with that they find to be successful.
Thank you, Krista.
Thank you.
We have another question from Katerina Mark. The challenge for some teachers might be integrating STAR into the various subject areas. Teachers are usually more comfortable with teaching concepts in isolation. Any suggestions for?
Yes, I understand not all teachers are as comfortable with this. What I would do is sit down with perhaps a grade level group of teachers, maybe, 7th grade social studies teachers or high school science teachers, and have them actually generate some areas where they feel these concepts connect or overlap. There's so much overlap, and when I've facilitated these discussions, I of course give some of my own ideas, but I find if we allow the teachers themselves to identify areas where they see connections, then they're more likely to put that information into their curriculum versus me telling them this is where it fits or this is how it goes, because they might not see it exactly the same way. It's really interesting because I don't experience these topics as separate, but some people do. I think everything that we do in education is related to our social emotional skills, our relationships that we have with one another, and how we can empower ourselves with creative thinking and critical thinking, for example, which is part of the STAR process, but also part of 21st century learning and part of what every teacher is doing in the classroom. Brainstorming solutions to a problem, for example, is a common activity that you could do in curriculum or in the STAR process, as is creating a hypothesis, projecting into the future, likely outcome of taking one action or another. These are academic skills, but they're social skills as well. So I find that if we can get together teachers who maybe teach the same type of content and have a brief discussion with them, they can generate some of these great ideas.
We have one last question, and this question comes from USA, from Kate Maloney, and she asks, she says, I really like STAR and I'm totally on board, but how do you teach STAR in cultures that are more indirect, like Latin America, where STAR will be culturally interpreted as directly attacking people?
Well, during the action step where we talk about respecting self and others and where we discuss communication strategies, listening is a strategy that's in there that we didn't talk about in this webinar, but it's a very important one, as is interpreting body language to understand what the speaker is saying, an iMessage so that people don't feel like they're being attacked. iMessages are very non-confrontational, as well as some strategies such as listening to someone and then summarizing their perspective or their point of view to show that you've understood. Also, I find that when we train an entire group of students with the STAR strategy and we explain to them what the purpose is and how we would like to use it, that it is a positive process that will help us get better at resolving our problems, that maybe it would help overcome some of that initial hesitancy. That being said, I'm open to critique and creative ideas and suggestions for how we could maybe make some changes to STAR or in the presentation of STAR that would make it feel very accessible to people from all different cultures. So I welcome your ideas with that. It's a great question. Thank you.
Thank you, Krista, one more time. There is a comment from Danny Abrams from DC. He says, regarding different cultures, perhaps writing things down will be helpful for students. They could then take turns reading what they have written or what someone else has written and then practice listening.
Great.
So, well, we don't have any more questions, Krista, and I would like to thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. So to everyone, as you can see in our PowerPoint slide right now, we will have a second and a third webinar. The second one will be Take a Stand, Teaching Students How to Stand Up to Stop Bullying in July 26. This next webinar will take place at 12:30 p.m. So that means it's going to take place 1 hour later than today, okay? And the third webinar will be Classroom and School-Wide Implementation of STAR and of Standard. As you can know, I'm sure many of you were able to read the complete synopsis. We will pre-practice everything, and it will be very important for everyone to be there, and of course for you to be able to receive a certificate. Thank you to everyone.
I just wanted to say thank you again for setting this up, and it was really wonderful to be on with so many people from their own home countries who I know are already doing wonderful work with their students. It's so important. The work is so important, and I value that they made the time to be here today, so thank you so much.